Ladies and gentlemen, when you're ready. Welcome to the second Raymond and Beverley Sackler Distinguished Lecture in Archaeology in honor of Professor Norman Hammond, on around resplendent in the front row. This, through the generosity of the benefactor, is a joint event hosted between the MacDonald Institute for Archaeological Research and Peterhouse. Our speaker tonight is Professor Stephen Houston, who is Dupay Family Professor of the Social Sciences in the Department of Anthropology at Brown University. Steve is actually here under two different guises. He is also, as several of you will have learned yesterday, here as our own MacDonald Distinguished Visiting Lecturer, and he gave a brilliant lecture yesterday afternoon, to be followed, I'm sure, by a still more brilliant one tonight. Now, the bad news for Steve is, as the audience is slightly different today, I have to say all those embarrassing things all over again. And I might be able to embellish a little further this time. Steve is a leading Mayanist, arguably the leading Mayanist, of a fortunate and intellectually fertile generation, the generation that inherited, in a sense, the consequences and the challenges and the opportunities of emergent decipherment of the Maya writing during the 1970s and the 1980s, a process, of course, which is still ongoing. Any one of you who heard his lecture yesterday will have picked up the details of still ongoing breakthroughs in decipherment month by month, year by year, as scholarship advances. But he is, in addition to that, a field worker, a prolific author, and a big thinker well beyond the Mayan world. He is the author of, co-author, author, or editor of at least 20 books, focusing on different aspects of Maya writing, art, culture, and society, with a particular focus on, of late, on the courtly culture of the Maya world, and beyond that, in a sense, the experiences, the experiential world of sound and sight and sense in Mesoamerica, in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. For this long list of achievements, this amazing track record, he's received a glittering array of awards, prizes, and other forms of recognition. From 2008 to 2012, he was a MacArthur Fellow. Steve yesterday modestly intervened and said that that didn't mean he was a genius, but we all know the nickname of the MacArthur Awards, the Genius Awards. It is the highest form of accolade that you can bestow upon an American citizen in academia. That's marvellous, but my favourite one is actually 2011 from the state of Guatemala, its highest form of accolade, the Order of the Quetzal. I think that is something. I hope you do get a large plumed badge of some kind. I really hope you do. For one of his more recent works, A Life Within, he was awarded the 2015 Prose Award, and inter alia, a couple of years earlier, the equally redolent in terms of its name, the Tatiana Proskoryakov Award for Mayan Studies from Harvard. In a minute, we're going to hear an extraordinary story of the ups and downs, trials and tribulations of kingship in a turbulent political moment in the Maya world. And it's just too great a coincidence that another piece of breaking news of an imminent lecture in Cambridge this autumn has also come through to me today. So for 30 seconds, I'm going to interrupt the flow of embarrassing things about Steve, and those of you who have long diaries can take a note of this. 10th of October, 2016, somewhere in the university, we're not quite sure where yet, another tale of royal wealth and burial in a period of strife. Jack Davis and Shari Stocker will be coming to give the breaking news presentation, the first in the UK, on the extraordinary finds that many of you will have followed in the headlines last year of the richest shaft grave type discovery in the Aegean world, Pylos, since Schliemann's breakthroughs at Mycenae itself. So in a sense, we can have a couple of pendants, New World and Old World, emergent kingship and struggle and turmoil, and a lot of beautiful things coming out of both holes, if I may say so, as we'll see. And with that rather inelegant final phrase, I'm going to turn over to Steve, who I do know actually, is going to give you a fantastic and riveting lecture, not only on a remarkable site, but a remarkable series of further interpretations and ideas that come from that. His title is Founders' Effects, Exploring a Royal Tomb at Zotz, Guatemala. Steve Houston, welcome to Cambridge again, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Cyprian. And it is indeed a great honor and pleasure to be here. I'm very grateful that Norman is here in front of us as well. I should point out that there are now, at this very moment, in this millisecond, 3 Mayanists in the United Kingdom, and they happen to be in this room. There's Liz Graham also from UCL. Now, today I'm going to be presenting to you a story which is going to take us quite a bit from the alleyways and the collegiate lawns of Cambridge colleges, in fact, to a far wetter, moister, and more tropical milieu, which is going to be at the lower center of this satellite image. And naturally, it's showing, in this instance, what is today the Republic of Guatemala, and also just to the north, we have Mexico, the states of Campeche, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo, and then also Belize, a former crown colony, where Liz and Norman have done much of their careers, very productive work. Now, what I will also do here is perhaps initiate you into the mysteries of this civilization by framing it in terms of a city that some of you might have heard of, namely Tikal, Guatemala. Untold numbers of tourists descend upon this city, and yet its vastness, its many, many little senderos or brechas or little cut paths allow you to feel lost in this great and important dynastic city of the first millennium AD. Very, very close by, in fact, is the city of El Zotz, or in one of its sectors, we would call it El Diablo. That's one of the pyramids that I'll be looking at today. It is relatively close to Tikal. In fact, as we'll see, it is very close indeed. Let me also take you not only in space, but also in time, back to May 29th, 2010, and it was a day that began with bright sun, overheated jungle as usual, birds active, various monkeys also wreaking havoc up in the jungle canopy. But as the day continued, things began to heat up and get really quite exciting in one component of the great city of El Zotz. And in fact, at 2 p.m. exactly, there, deep within one of the pyramids within this dynastic city, we began to find out that something interesting indeed was coming out. And the abstract that I circulated for this was, of course, quoting Howard Carter about wonderful things being seen, and indeed very soon wonderful things indeed did come out of this excavation. Now this is Don Humberto, who is our tunelero, or tunneler par excellence. We work under appalling conditions that would not be countenanced by OSHA, which is the regulatory body in the United States, but here we tunnel in, often without anything but the wisdom of gentlemen such as this, with decades of experience in tunneling, and we knew we were on what would prove to be a somewhat, if you will, a radioactive deposit. Don Humberto is leaning over, he's tapping with a little hammer, and we've just basically suspended and then dropped down a single light bulb. And you could see that a cavity has opened up and a small light has begun to emerge. Because what we have just found is one of the most important Maya royal tombs yet discovered. And from a time, as Cyprian mentioned before, that is tumultuous, that is highly exciting and indeed mysterious, remains quite enigmatic for us. I have now descended into the pit. I tend to step to the side as more capable excavators do their work, and I'm using my little SAA-approved hammer and chisel and beginning to tap away at the capstone so as to enlarge that hole and so that we could peek down below to evaluate the trouble that we're in, what awaits us. And indeed, this is what I saw within seconds, and the photograph was taken just about that time. It was a chamber full of dynastic and royal treasure, of the sort that is rarely seen in excavations, alas, too often seen in collections of looted artifacts around the world. This is my co-director, Edwin Roman, who is looking happy, very happy in this image, and he's looking up at me. All of us were much aged by this experience. Here he looks as though he's 25, now he looks about 65 at least. And again, to affirm and in fact verify that I do indeed do excavation, you can see me there looking up above this little cavity. Someone commented to my wife when she saw these photographs of me in the field, "How do you keep him clean?" Well, she doesn't, and I'm usually a filthy mess in the jungle, sweaty and dirty and covered with all sorts of debris. Now, as we opened that aperture and we lowered cameras, we were able to see this before us, and it proved to be, for us, a tremendously challenging experience. It was a dangerous kind of excavation with deep security concerns because of cartel activity in this area. But eventually, through arduous effort and literally around-the-clock digging, we were on a 24-hour cycle, generators humming and running all the while, because we knew we were in some danger from tomb thieving. We were able to, in this case, result in what I think was a decent excavation under the challenging conditions of the time and the two plan you see before you. Now, in American archaeology, we quickly either run to, or this august body called the National Geographic tends to get involved very quickly, and often tends very quickly indeed to distort what we found. I love this particular moment of PR absurdity. It's an odd Maya tomb, and that's maybe the way I should have pitched this lecture. Come to hear oddity. Jeweled teeth and more, right? Yields jeweled teeth. Absurd. Now, I'm going to step back a little bit, and I know that in this audience, again, there are only two other Mayanists, albeit very distinguished ones, to frame this in terms of a larger issue, one that perhaps will resonate with you working in other parts of the world. And of course, this coming October, I believe, you're going to hear something very similar to this from Jack Davies. The larger issues have to do, in fact, with this glyph that you see before you. And that glyph is one I'll talk about in just a second or so, but it has to do with a term that I have pinched from Paul Binsky, the eminent medievalist, formerly at Yale and I believe now here at Cambridge, called the special dead. And the special dead is, I think, a flexible, you might say, portmanteau category that allows us to look not just at any of the deceased or the hundreds of bodies that might be found in a medieval cemetery here in Cambridge, let's say under a monastery or the like, but rather focal figures, apical figures, unusual figures who are there at the beginnings of dynasties, dead who mean something very special to the living. This glyph, which I promise to explain right now, is actually quite readable for us. It reads Umuknal, which means it is the burial place, and directly thereafter be the name of a king. It is occasionally there in Maya inscriptions, not alas in this one, but they do help to elucidate much of how the Maya might have understood the special dead of their world. Let me pull back a little bit further again, and partly it's to open the conversation, to get people engaged with material they might know a little bit better. Focal figures in the past are well known to all of us. This is, in fact, I believe a 16th to 17th century Chinese ancestral diagram, such as might have been suspended in the hall of a building in imperial China. You see the multitude of figures down below, and then this human pyramid extending up to the top. You see fewer and fewer individuals until you eventually get, and notice that they get also gradually larger in size, you get to the founders of this family, a male-female pair. A way to understand this, you might say, to cast it in more regal terms, in terms of sovereignty and governance, would be not just to look at this within the framework of a particular family, but of focal rulers. Now, for those of you who do Chinese archaeology, you might recognize that this rubbing is from a Han stone carving, and indeed it is of the so-called Yellow Emperor. Probably he didn't exist, but the Chinese of some generations past thought that he did, and he was a figure that, among other things, invented undergarments, I'm told, in addition to plantations and fields and farms and so forth. He is a focal ruler. He is someone at the beginning of a dynasty from which descended all of these imperial figures that we know about through subsequent dynasties from the Shang onwards. Now, to again bring it a little closer to home, as I did yesterday with an image from a King's College chapel, sometimes, though, these dynasties encounter breaks. There are hiccups within the succession of kings or emperors, and this is something that we well known to all of you. This is, of course, a portrait of Henry VII by, as I understand it, an unknown painter. What happens when a new dynasty comes into play? What are the various stratagems by which that new dynasty is implanted, by which it is validated, by which it is authorized by the people? How is that done? What do the kings and their followers, their entourage, do to make that happen? And it doesn't just happen once. We also have what was he called? The wisest fool in Christendom. We have James I. I'm not sure what he was called in the Scottish succession. And just a little bit later, we get, of course, George I, from whom the current dynasty is descended. There's a story, as all of you well know from your school years, of what happens in between and of all the things and the shenanigans that take place in a regal dimension to make sure that these kings and their descendants stay on the throne. What, therefore, is the system of validation by which this takes place? The tomb I'm going to describe is also, as Cyprian mentioned before, encased within another kind of tumult, another sort of political chaos enmeshing this area at the time. And I will call these exacerbations. In other words, you not only have the trouble of implanting a new dynasty on the landscape in a material, concrete way that would be acknowledged openly by subjects and even by enemies and friends, but we also have here a very particular set of, you might say, irritants or vexations within the globe or world of the time, which in this instance only extends up into Mexico and slightly beyond, in which there are moments of aggression, indeed, that involve a city that many of you have heard about, and is called Teotihuacan. We don't know what they called it themselves, but it is the city of the gods as the Aztecs would have understood it. And as many of you may know, the Aztecs themselves were proto-archaeologists and went to Teotihuacan to dig and to find treasure and inspiration for their own imperial experiments. This is a view of Teotihuacan along the the Street of the Dead. There's the Pyramid of the Sun in the background. Extraordinary work is now going on there. That empire centered on Teotihuacan, and that is the only word that I can use to describe it because it has far-reaching impact across Mesoamerica at this period, is one that also touches close to home in a very intimate manner with the dynasties near and around and in El Zotz. In fact, one of the most important dates in the entire canon of such inscriptions, it comes from Tikal, Stela 31, the site that some of you may well have visited. And there, on January 16th in AD, or Common Era 378, an event happened which is called by Mayanes La Entrada. It is the entrance, it is an intrusive, apparently, presence coming into the zone. Now, I don't wish here to enter in all of the debates and to's and fro's among various scholars about what this might mean, but I think all of us can at least agree that there is some signal moment of important contact between Teotihuacan and local dynasties at that time. And my good friend David Stewart has even monitored on a day-by-day basis the progress of this particular figure coming into Teotihuacan. Who is that figure? He's a person whose name we can decipher as Siakak, which means he who is born from fire, probably having to do with fire rituals that we know emanate from that city and then become firmly enmeshed in Maya ritual practice as well. He is the embodiment of all that is foreign. And when he is depicted by Maya sculptors on a Maya sculpture, he is shown not as a Maya, but in the garments of a foreign warrior, of a warrior of the city of Teotihuacan. So there's a bellicose element, you might say, to this contact. So why also was I looking at El Zotz? One reason was simply, if I may use this analogy, it comes out of, maybe Americans would understand a little bit better, but what happens at the margins of a sequoia? If you have a sequoia, this gigantic redwood growing in the forest, what happens to the other trees, the other little bushes, the arbustos growing around it? What happens on the edge of a prepotent polity? What happens there? And I thought, let's not go to the largest city of all. Let's go, and also as a training exercise, as a place for future PhD work, to an area very close to Tikal that seems to have been buffeted by its presence over the course of some centuries. And here, within 24 kilometers exactly, is El Zotz in relation to Tikal. Why else would we go to El Zotz? It is because it is the most catastrophically looted site I have ever been to. Every single house mound of just under a meter in height has been looted. It seems on the basis of, you might say, folk tales that much of this was done locally by recent settlers to the zone, but the more ambitious trenches, some of which we were cleaning out, were probably done by the Guatemalan army just before the Dirty War commenced. It was a lucrative business for them. To give you idea of how deeply some of these trenches go, they'll pass right through the center of a fairly large pyramid, such as in this case, that looter's trench is outlined for you in this red splotch going across the bottom of a pyramid. And what happened as a result of that was that they cleaned out a royal tomb, and not just one royal tomb, but 2, but 3, but 4. We've now counted about 8 to 9 royal tombs, and many of the finest early classic Maya pots that are in a variety of public and private collections around the world almost certainly came from these deposits. And this is all that's left. It's this empty, rather haunting cavity, painted red as the Maya would do to show perhaps the continuance of life. It's, after all, the color of the sun and the life. And here's an even smaller one nearby, all of them emptied out. Occasionally, we would dig and scratch around them. We'd do some sieving, find a little piece of jade or so, a piece of specular hematite, but that's about it. All of these date to a time in which Zotz mattered, in which it did seem to establish itself as a presence of some importance in relation to the sequoia growing very, very obviously nearby, that is, to the dynasty of Tikal. Some of these pots are demonstrably from Zotz because of the inscriptions found thereon. Here, of all places, Australia, at the National Gallery of Australia, is a pot that we know was looted from at least one of those chambers I just showed you. And I think one of the reasons to do the archaeology and to look at these kinds of collections, both public and private, is to make a compelling case for repatriation, if we can do so. And more recently, and this is a better story to tell you, a little less sad, a wooden lintel, rare indeed in this tropical setting, that's so rarely preserved, was hacked out of the pyramid that I showed you being looted before, that had been looted in the past by the Guatemala military. It found its way into the Denver Museum of Art, and there, thank goodness, it was eventually repatriated because of evidence that had been compiled by that very great Mayanist, I should have mentioned it before, Ian Graham, who is still with us, as I understand. This is now in Guatemala City, where it belongs. Zotz is fascinating for another reason. It has more to do with the style of pottery, which is what I would call the red background style. There is a coloristic fixation in this dynasty on red pottery, not of an Athenian sort, but one that is often covered with these particular kinds of spirit beings. Now, this is one of the glyphs that I deciphered about 20 years ago, and it reads, Wai. Now, that's the word for Maya, in Maya for sleep. But it's also the word for, you might say, their theory of dreams, and beyond that, of spirits that roam at night, that are tethered by indissoluble bonds to the spirits of living kings. And they are the ones who are shown here on many, many such pots. The first place in which these spirits occur in the canon of Maya art is here at El Zotz. So it would seem that on the edge of this great polity, which must have been very, very kind of oppressive presence on the near horizon, we see also a considerable degree of spiritual experimentation, or at least in its representation. From all of these figments, these little pieces of evidence, we can begin to piece together a bit of a dynasty, a bit of a sequence of kings. This is one such king. It's on a piece that used to be in the Barbier-Muller Museum. I think it's gone off to Dubai. The Sheikh has bought it, I'm sure. But from all of these, we can assemble a history, albeit one that is detached from the archaeology. And I am, above all, an archaeologist. That's what I trained to be, although I've done a lot of work in glyphs and in imagery. And I like to combine the two. I think that's what makes archaeology in the Maya region today so fun. So let's go to Diablo. This is not something you'd say in polite company in Guatemala. Al diablo vámonos. No, we're not going to do that. Really, we're going to do it somewhat figuratively. And let's go to one part of El Zotz. Of course, it's shown here as a kind of a sprinkle of black acne across a face here. This is the actual concentration, not, alas, assembled for us by LiDAR, although I wish we had access to that technology. It's been far too expensive for us, but by brute force mapping, cutting with basically sight lines through the jungle and then taking out our total stations. Now, they're on a high escarpment above a valley that is called the Buena Vista Valley. Here's our map, and I cannot tell you how arduous that map was to produce, but there, 500 feet above, you might say downtown El Zotz, is a palatial sector which we call El Diablo, the devil. A variety of motivations have been given to me as to why why they've assigned this rather inauspicious name to this pyramid. Some people say it's so hard to climb up. Some people say, "Que diablo, what are we doing this for? Why are we going up the escarpment?" I'm not going to resolve that tonight, nor will I ever be able to do so. But what I can resolve for you here is that it is an area uniquely so of visual dominance in this landscape. And of course, all of us have played around with the magic that is geographical information systems. And we can see here that from the Diablo Palace, there is a heightened and an extraordinary degree of visibility of areas far, far distant, including most of the kingdom down below, and the smaller, flatter areas in which most of the farming must surely have been done to support this kingdom. Now, there's another feature that has everything to do with why I went to this area intellectually, and it has to do with these little nubbins that you see on this photograph in front of you. You'll see a little hump, a little bump, a little black splotch, and let's get a little bit closer. Those are some of the most important temples in the Maya area as seen from Diablo. That's Temple 4. Untold numbers of tourists have gone there. George Lucas, in fact, sent filmmakers there, and it is featured in the very first Star Wars movie, the only one worth looking at, in my opinion. And over to the side here is Temple 3. Now, ironically enough, these probably would not have been visible, since they're what we call late classic, they're from some centuries later, by the people living at Diablo. But they would have seen smoke rising, they would have seen fires at night, and they might have heard marauding troops coming close by, all too close by. So let's move up further. On this day, 5 years ago, we go up to this high area mapped again, and you can make out here in our rendering the palatial group that is called El Diablo, but in particular, there is a building that looters always know to turn to, as do archaeologists, which is the eastern mound of a palatial complex in this part of Guatemala. Why? It's because without variance, without any exception that I know about, they contain royal tombs. The eastern position here is going to be very important for us in just a second or so. We call it prosaically structure F81. I'm never going to use that again, so just throw that out of your mind. It was first seen through looters' pits, looters' tunnels in 1978 by some of the first explorers coming into this area after the Guatemalan military. I'm told, it doesn't go beyond this room, other than with this video apparently, yeah, I'm a dead man. Okay, so the Guatemalan military exposed this buried building within later structures, and it was covered with polychrome, stuccoed ornament. And it was for this reason that when I was talking to the great Mayanist Ian Graham about 10 years ago, he said, Steve, I would go work there. It's something that could be really quite fascinating in terms of monumental facades. And this is what that same area looked like in 2010. It had been looted yet further. So we had these initial glimpses of a partly looted site. A few tunnels had essayed or penetrated into the core or hearting of these pyramids, but it had gotten, so much worse. I call this the Great Looting. And again, it almost certainly was done under military sponsorship. It was the brother, in fact, of the then president of the time, a colonel in the Guatemalan military. And this is our drawing done by the standards or conventions of my archaeology of all of the little, you might say, you could probably see the walls and the layerings as we go in along a looter's tunnel. This was not cut by us. We had cleaned it up to do this drawing, but it was cut by these looters, to the extent, in fact, that there were even rumors that there were dead looters in some of the tunnels. You could imagine our state of mind as we go into this place. And there, the tunnel stopped at the end of what I've just shown you. I am dead certain, maybe not the right adjective, that this took place at the inception of the Dirty War, the Civil War, in which the military found other things to do in Guatemala, which involved rather more sinister activities. Now, the first phase of this project was done under my direct authority and my permit under Brown University with support from National Endowment for the Humanities, National Science Foundation. The second phase, which is still ongoing, they're starting in, I guess, about 5 days once more, is under my protege Tom Garrison at the University of South Carolina. And I think this is a positive development. Most of the funding is now from Guatemala itself and from local Guatemalan figures. We have gone in, for instance, and done mini LiDAR. This is an example, an experiment with LiDAR in which we're recording these irregular looters' tunnels and showing you what they might look like by means of a zillion different measurements. What have we learned from this? Well, what we learned also from our own excavations, stratigraphically, is that this was a de novo establishment. Underneath, nothing. Bedrock. In other words, no one had been here before, as far as we could tell. A few scattered sherds from the early years of Maya settlements, such as Liz and Norman have studied, but something very new was being positioned here. The temple itself was also, as I said, encased by later buildings, but this has also afforded us a sort of, if you will, a protective ruination. And this is what also allowed that extraordinary stucco to be preserved, because frankly, it was a temple that failed. Very quickly, they had to encase it in later constructions after it was ritually, you might say, demobbed. Now, I am calling this, and I think with reason, as you'll see soon, the Temple of the Night Sun, which is a bit of a paradox, but I'll explain why I'm using those unusual, those phrases so seldom used together. Now, this is a reconstruction of what the temple looked like before it was covered by subsequent construction. It has an east-west orientation, which instantly indicates to us that it is somehow tied to movement of the sun, something that intrigues the Maya no end, and which configures a good deal of their monumental architectural landscape. And there you can see it going directly above. So that if you were standing in front of this building every morning, you would see the sun arising directly out of it. And this is going to be important as we discuss the tomb in just a second or so. It is also a building that is blazoned not with heraldry, but with monumental stucco. And here are some of my drawings of the stuccos in fragments. They're only visible because of a tunnel that is about the width of one of these little benches here. So it does not work for the claustrophobic, but with a great deal of photogrammetry, we're eventually able to do drawings from which I could do tracings that then could be checked against the field. The entire surface of this building was covered with stucco, which very quickly began to fail under the onslaught of the seasonal rains, the effects of the sun. It had been painted very, very bright red, a little like those tombs we were looking at earlier, but that soon began to simply erode off the surface. Now, I'm so there. I want to be there right now. But this is, of course, the Caribbean. Yeah, I haven't been there for years. But I'm showing it for a reason, because it has everything to do with the way the Maya understood the sun. Because, you see, the sun for them, and this is something we've been able to sort out through iconography, through texts, arises out of an eastern sea. That is, of course, off the coast of Belize and Quintana Roo. And then it goes up over the sky, but then it submerges once again, passing through a kind of Piscean, almost shark-like existence as they depict the sun, and then goes underground where it acquires jaguar-like characteristics. That is quintessentially the iconographic token of something that is dark and nocturnal, signs of the jaguar, and then it arises once again. It's a view of a sun that goes underground, a sun that rather than being blazoned has a kind of intense obscurity to it at certain times. It is the essence of darkness. To look at some of these iconographic and stucco programs on the building, let me look on one side of it. I'll decode some of this imagery for you now. It's hard to make out naturally, but I will hope to at least give you a sense of what is depicted here on. There is, for instance, in the background, a linear band, which we know is the way the Maya would show the sky itself. It's a series of emblems that are planetary, that are snake-like, that are eagle-like, but have everything to do with an arching band across heaven. And then in between are aspects of the solar god. That is, not just in its daytime aspect, but also when it has acquired jaguar-like characteristics, when it's passed underground. All the aspects of the daily, the diurnal life cycle, if you will, of the sun, therefore, are on this building for all to see, painted red. Occasionally you'll see these little jets of shooting off down below. That is for the Maya hot breath, something that will scald and burn and is a weapon of the gods. Sometimes other kinds of deities, equally celestially, begin to appear on this facade. There is a god that some of you might have heard of, Chak, the rain god. He is depicted here in, to me, one of the most extraordinary and very beautiful stuccos of the Maya. And his name is attached to his forehead, and this is another interesting point, in archaic style, as though the Maya are attempting to reproduce a writing system that has not been employed by their scribes for many, many generations. And he is called, appropriately enough, the loud one, the speech in the sky. He is indeed a bellowing figure. Other beings here, though, are the sun god themselves, and they love to gorge on blood. And we know this because around all of their mouths are streaked are these little crenellated things, little features that I've highlighted for you here in red, which show the gouts of blood that they wish to feed on. And the sun god in particular delights in the hearts of humans, so we know. Chak too likes to get in on the party and gets into the feast, and he too has a blood-smeared mouth. So in looking at this, you would, I suspect, as a passerby, be impressed, a little bit horrified, a little scared. Now, it gets even more interesting because occasionally, particularly in the fronts of the buildings, right by the entrances where people would go in and out of this temple of the night sun, are heads that are almost fetishized. They're very abstract, they're very simplified, and these, I am certain, are in fact the upside-down heads of captives. These are headhunters. These are people who are almost Amazonian in their attachment, their affection for going out and grabbing the heads of enemies, which then would be worn as regalia in their bodies, with bleached hair hanging downwards. That is a much later stucco from the city of Quirigua. And then one of the most extraordinary things, too, that I noticed just a few years ago is I believe this is one of the very few buildings which was famous to the Maya. Some buildings were probably celebrated to them across many different dynasties. And on the back of that very same sculpture we looked at before, Stela 31, is this statement, which reads, "It happened at the place of the nighttime sun." And I suspect here at Tikal they're referring exactly to this building, and the dates fit exactly as well. And there you can see the nighttime sun and its jaguar aspects. Now, what about the tomb? The tomb is not under the back of the building, and this is where the looters went awry, because that's where they thought it was. It was indeed in front in a building that we're calling the sanctuary, a separate structure that was erected, at least from stratigraphically, we know this, after the construction of the building behind it. As we began digging into that deposit towards the tomb, we soon discovered many, many astonishing deposits that also send chills up and down our spines. For instance, in each one of these pots were single fingers that were articulatable and that had been placed into these small dishes, often with a small outline of darkened soil around them. I suspect that was decayed flesh. These continued. We call them caches, but we also know that they were probably removed unwillingly, we suspect, from whoever provided this. In fact, my good friend and colleague at Brown, Andy Scherer, who's one of our best archaeologists, has found cut marks in many of them in which someone has slowly sawn them off. As we look at the front of the tomb, the sanctuary, that is where the tomb was found. But I'll tell you something, is when we looked in there, I could not for the life of me figure out how we're going to get into there, because the surface was completely covered with all sorts of vessels, and deposits. And so we resolved to go in front and to go down over the stairway so as to access the tomb in a slightly different manner and not taking us into those very, very structurally unstable areas the looters had been in about 20 years. And so we began digging, and very, very soon we hit other kinds of deposits that showed that this was, in some ways, a temple not only towards the majesty of the king, but also very much drawn upon the misery of many people. There were bodies, often of children, that had been encased, still burning into a variety of cache vessels. Here's one right there. This has been laid out for you, almost Lucy fashion, by Andy Scherer. We're calling this cache 3, but it's a skeleton of a child. And more to the point, as we looked very carefully at the skull, you could see that there are still remnants of burnt hair on it. And this was just the beginning, because further down, as we began to get towards the tomb, hoping to access it on bedrock and move laterally in, more and more of these deposits began coming out of this set of fingers, of those set of fingers, of a single incisor placed in one of these deposits. What I suspect this tells us is that most archaeologists go into these tombs from the top, but they're surrounded by a magical perimeter, probably of many caches that many of us never find. This is what the tomb looked like. This is what it looked like when we first entered the chamber, and this is what it looked like after a couple of weeks. And again, we had to do this very quickly because it was really quite dangerous, and I was not sure I could assure the safety of our staff, nor could we leave the tomb because it would have been looted. Now, I'm going to tell you about what we discovered in the tomb. And this is where it gets rather interesting in terms of the nature of kingship among the Maya. And we're going to look first at how these objects were placed within the tomb. They were first placed up by the head of the king, and we know from the overlap of the objects, they eventually came out the bottom of the tomb and then exited up in this way. We know this because the tomb must have been open for at least a couple of days. There's a plastered area underneath this red line. And above, I think if you look very carefully, you'll see that there's no internal plastering. So no one was left there like some horrific Edgar Allan Poe story to finish the plastering inside, but they almost certainly exited out the capstone to the side. Something else I noticed, since I'm a Pennsylvania boy and we see these things all the time, was a wall, particularly the southern exposed area of what had been the open tomb, with all of these strange little cupules, many of these, hundreds in fact, and I knew immediately that these were potter wasp nests. And indeed, I shipped these to, and such a person actually exists, the greatest international authority on potter wasps, dubious distinction. He's at the American Museum of Natural History, and he has duly told me, yes, this is a potter wasp nest. So they had been placed there probably about 600 years ago by buzzing potter wasps, charging the tombs. They will often deposit with their larvae a stunned and neutralized offering so that the larvae can continue. And those potter wasps, of course, never made it out of here alive. What's also fascinating is the abundance of these tells us this was almost certainly done when the mud was still rather viscous within the tomb, and probably because of the clustering, the swarming at the beginning of the rainy season. So this is the deposit as I've drawn it for you, many different layers. This is where the principal occupant was, outlined for you in green. And he was almost certainly the king. This is the person that I'm going to be focusing on, and we are calling him prosaically Skeleton A. Now, Andy Scher has noticed one thing. First of all, hipsters in Brooklyn have nothing on the Maya. Here we have bling, 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 including jade inlays across the teeth. This is uniquely and I would say categorically an attribute of royalty among the Maya. You see lots of other inlays and filings, but jade is very unusual in this region. We know this gentleman was over 35 years of age. We know he was a gentleman. It was not burned, something I'm going to get to a little bit later, and he had begun to show the wear and tear of being presumably a warrior, someone who was relatively active, because across his body we found evidence of osteophytes and other elements in his vertebrae of incipient arthritis. He was hurting a bit. He probably wasn't moving around with a great deal of agility. How was he buried? He was probably first embalmed in some way. We imagine his viscera might have been removed, and then his bones were sprinkled with a viscous specular hematite, which is actually directly impregnated on the surface. He had been prepared. They were waiting probably for something, perhaps the accumulation of the treasure in the tomb, to put him away. Cinnabar powder was applied, then a brown material. Almost certainly this would be textile. So this was a mummy bundle. He was encased, and he was placed on what I will call the jade bier. And it's a color that really comes in with Teotihuacan. It's a jade green-blue. We saw it when we first entered the tomb in these long pieces of paper-thin stucco, which regrettably were very hard to lift. This is what the bier might have looked like. It had some attachments to the wall, and it's part of a kind of feature that you would find at a Maya court called a tem in Maya. It's a portable throne. He might have sat on this in life and certainly lay on it in death. Eventually, it collapsed. Now, as we look through these deposits, and here I'm getting to what it tells us ultimately, is I believe it is encapsulating for us the summation of royal roles. And they're played out here, not in a random assortment of treasure, and a treasure indeed it would have been for the Maya, but a set of activities which would have shown that this was a king that knew his stuff. This is a king who knew how to behave. The first thing we can say is he must have been understood to be the great sacrificer. He is surrounded by all of these bodies. And we might ask, why then would those activities, obviously subsequent to his death and placement in the tomb, have anything to do with his own abilities? It's because, well, I'll get to that a little bit later. How was he a sacrificer? This is actually a very curious aspect of the tomb, is that there are 5 other people with the king. People in a sense, they're not maybe full-fledged adults, but they would have been children. 2 were approximately 4 to 5 years of age, and they're only found as skulls. And here you can see 2 of them, somewhat schematically laid out for you. These are children who can walk, who can talk, who probably have some notion of their identity. There's probably some psychological, you might say, developmental statement being made about them. But this is the other point about sacrifice, because in many of the other pots directly under the royal bier are much younger infants who would not have been able to walk, may not have been capable of speaking. It's almost as though the Maya are categorically distinguishing between these in the tomb. All of the heads face east. All of the bodies appear to face east. They're oriented towards the sun and seem deliberately to have been done so. Now, why, again, do I think of the king as a sacrificer? It's because in his hand, he clutched, I say in quotation marks, one of the largest obsidian macro blades I've ever seen, and it was right by his hand. In fact, not just his left hand, but his right hand. I think we don't have a lefty here, Cyprian. And there, to the side, is a drawing by one of our great microware analysts, Kazuo Ayoma, and also our lithics expert, Zach Ruby. They did studies of these. In fact, this object was sat through the great tsunami and earthquake in Japan. It's a miracle it eventually made its way back to Guatemala. But you can see here Ayoma's various photographs, which show almost without question, because he's done an extensive study of functional analyses of these surfaces and edges, that this was used for cutting and sawing bone in particular, whittling bone. And in addition to that, we even see evidence of cinnabar and other strange red residues. Regrettably, we were not able to find any human hemoglobins on these deposits, although we tried. It probably was not hafted. Andy Scher, the bioarchaeologist I mentioned before, has discovered some interesting things about the people that went into the tomb with the king. First of all, the children and the infants are not related to one another. They have various metric and non-metric attributes in particular. They're all more or less the same age. We don't think they're related to one another. They might even have been purchased. They might have been taken as war captives. This seems equally to be the case of the adults, and they could have come possibly from one or two people in particular. An individual we can imagine would have experienced unendurable agony. Where would these sacrifices have taken place? We found another altar here, which was part of that assemblage of the open tomb. And all of these ceremonies are going on while the king's body is either lying there open and the potter wasps are active. But we also know that in the surface of this object, which has the image of a god outside, was a thick resinous deposit, which regrettably also did not prove to be easily analyzed. Within the tomb itself, we see sacrificial birds, which are beloved by many sacrificial figures throughout, priests throughout Mesoamerica, including this adorable little bobwhite, the Colinus virgianus. He was a performer, so that was one role. He also is someone, we believe, who danced. And yesterday, Liz Demery asked a very good question. What is it the king's supposed to do? Well, the king kills. That's part of his ultimate prerogative. But the king is also someone who dances. The king undertakes this sacred activity, which we do not ordinarily think of as being a principal attribute of kings, but it's something that seemed to have been front and central for them. How do we know this? We know this because the jade found in abundance in the tomb can be matched exactly to depictions of almost musical jade celts, carefully graded by size. It almost seems Chinese or Warring States period in some respects. And you can see them lining up here. And these assemblages are also found in the form of jade mosaic masks, which we recovered from the tomb as well. These are found with people who are dancing to music in the imagery. The orientation is also quite fascinating because we can link it to images of other kings at the time. And in fact, many of these objects I was just showing you were found behind, at the small of the back of the king, as you can see here on another carved panel that has been known for some time. And there they are linked to one another. And then finally, what else would the king wear while he was cavorting and dancing about and making these clinking noises, and sometimes jingling with little shells? He would wear a jaguar pelt. And this was an animal that was uniquely pertinent to royal appearances. Only kings seem to have been able to wear this particular critter. Rare then, rare now, I suspect. We have found little phalanges from phalids in the tomb, and we suspect they were part of these garments. And then the other music, the other jingling and clinking, comes from innumerable conch shells, which you can see here. And for their little clappers inside, we have dog canines, and these too are depicted in Maya images of kings in the midst of dance. That is a Maya dog. I assure you it's a Maya dog from Guatemala, and this will make you very sad, 117 of these actually were either killed or somehow had their teeth extracted to go into the ornament that would be worn by the king in this tomb. There's a lot of investment. In addition to that, we have spondylus shells, blood red in their color, taken from far distant seas, and each one would have a little jade clapper perhaps, or even sometimes ones also a spondylus. There's evidence of wear as they would bounce against the surface again and again, and these would have made for a king who knew how to dance. And this does not seem important to us, but would have been for them. In addition, the king eats. The king eats a lot. He demands a lot, and some of this consumption is rather magical. Around his neck, here by his vertebrae, we found a collar of many, many spondylus shells. This must have been an important material for them because they underwent innumerable repairs as well. I've gotten a little bit broken or chipped, and the Maya would place another little filed piece of spondylus directly on it. So it was somewhat flawed or repaired material. But there in his mouth was a jade bead. In fact, this was probably the finest jade, jewelry jade that we've ever seen in this part of northern Guatemala, and there you can see it. This is directly linked, something we can link to other royal interments in the Maya area. And we also know from historical accounts that when someone was interred, a bead would be placed in the mouth as something that would encapsulate breath essence, which I discussed yesterday, and would also be perhaps placed or inserted within a mass of dough, maize dough, then forced into the mouth. There is such a tamale, and these would have been in the many, many pots that surrounded the king. And here you see all of the tamales. These are ones that I would like to license to Disney. Those are really adorable little peccary, by the way, and they're showed by these little volutes on them that they are smelly creatures, musky things. Many of these bowls, and we know these are all used for serving tamales. There was a great heap of food going in with the king. Had, in fact, these effigy lids, they were always inverted. They were always placed incorrectly, so to speak, with respect to the effigy, so that the tail of the bottom part we connected to the head of the top. All sorts of problems here. Now, for those of you who like Oriental cuisine, there's also evidence of steaming, maybe of dumplings, and of special vessels that probably were open underneath and might have had textiles on them, as we indeed found in the tomb. And then drinking. What would we do without drink? And this is an example at the feet of the king of an exploded vessel. It must have contained some kind of liquid which was so volatile that eventually it broke out through the bottom and not through the lid, which had been cased with chalk. These are depicted in Maya art, and on this we have a glyph that says, this is for pulque. This is for a particularly slightly inebriating drink, but if consumed in abundance, I guarantee you that you will stagger around. It might also be that the explosion, though, comes from the inclusions of calcium within this liquid, and this reminds me of something that many of us have consumed, pozol. It's a common maize drink. It's almost a liquid stew, but which we contain much amounts of calcium. These pots are extraordinary in the tomb. These are the treasures of the period, and they tell us something about Maya microcosms in pottery. Now, the monkeys on the lids of these vessels are not spider monkeys. They are, here goes, howler monkeys. These are very interesting. The first morning you hear them in the jungle, and then they begin to irritate. So why the howler monkey? It is because he is a harbinger of the morning, and he is also very active in the evening. He is the bellowing one. He is someone who is associated with scribal wisdom as well. And this is a close-up drawing of one of the pots. He has here a variety of iconographic attributes. He's got a floral headdress, not worn by most howler monkeys I've seen out in the jungle. A little snub nose tells you that he's a monkey. And he is found frequently in Maya iconography, as I've seen after looking at comparative analyses. Here in a bowl from the city at Becan, which is partly in Teotihuacan style, we see the howler monkey, and his mouth is open in a bellowing roar. And coming out from his mouth are two eagles, which are also associated with the sun. One is a night eagle with nocturnal jaguar-like attributes, and the other is a day eagle. These themes play out across the tomb. This is no haphazard collection of pots, but rather carefully thought through, and it's a tale we can probably sort out. One of the extraordinary deposits, too, we found within the tomb is much evidence of wooden objects. And I saw some extraordinary things today at the Must Farm site that were of wood that has survived. This is wood that was encased in such thick stucco, polished and then subsequently painted in these delicate pastel colors that even though the wood has disappeared, they have retained their form. And the tomb was full of these kinds of objects of a lost world of Maya art. Now, this object is, in fact, a heron. And nearby was found this polychrome little fish, and I reconstructed the open beaks by which it might have been consumed. This motif is found in other examples of Maya pottery throughout the time, in which we have the heron, and he is duly reaching over here in the lid of the vessel to pluck a fish out of the water. And then underneath, you'll see other kinds of beasts and other kinds of critters, which were in fact found in the tomb as well. I should, though, emphasize for those of you who are interested in ancient technology that I have found here in looking at these objects a technology I'd never seen before in the New World. And it had to do with how these wooden surfaces were prepared eventually for the polishing and stuccoing. Because if you look at the back of this particular deposit, there is this little dust-like element, as you can make out, which I've highlighted for you in yellow. I am convinced that this is very similar to a kind of paste made out of mulberry wood employed in the manufacture of Japanese dolls. It's called toso, and the Maya seem to have used a very similar kind of material, perhaps to even out some of the irregularities of the wood that they were using for this stuccoing process. Now, under that bowl we just looked at, what else do we have? We have this little snouted fellow who's rooting around down below. And for those of us who spend any time in the jungle not listening to howler monkeys, we also know that there, long before you see them, you smell them, are peccaries. And here they are in this kind of microcosm of terrestrial beings whose peccary snouts are always down below, serving also as supports for this tetrapod. And up above is an aquatic bird. All of the world is made small there, and there is one of these peccaries. It's a compression of the world in the pot, and that's something we see too. He is also in the tomb someone who is rich, rich beyond imagining. How do we know this? It's because of the quantity of jade found within the tomb. We have ear spools, and as Zach Ruby has pointed out to me, our lithicist, these can be matchable to each other because of veins within them, and shown to have come from single nodules of jade, which have been later worked in this site and made into a finer form. And for the first time ever, we have found evidence of standardized measurement. And this is in the form of chunks of specular hematite, probably mixed with some organic binder, which were found in groupings of 5. There are some irregularities in their width, but their height varies from each other with only an extent of a couple of millimeters at best. And this is something that, for us, indicates probably a trade material that was very carefully and minutely and precisely measured by the Maya. And probably this, too, eventually was used in preparing the royal body. This was the viscous stuff that covered his bones. It began to melt slightly in the tomb, which occasionally had moments of instability on the walls. And if you look carefully here at the left, you'll see the petate, the little impressions of a mat underneath that has long since disappeared. These pigments are known in other parts of the Americas. They're known, for instance, among the Chumash, or the central coast of California, often with blood binders. And this is an example, the only photograph I've been able to find, of one of these pigment cakes, and then there's the bivalve container over to the side. Ultimately, again, I think these were part of mortuary preparation in the tomb, and there was simply a leftover, a residue, which they set aside. Finally, among the treasures of the tomb, and this is something that I was discussing with Rach yesterday, I believe the day before, which is unprepossessing objects. Things such as textiles are not often prized by people, let's say, in the West, or not always, but for the Maya and for many peoples indeed, and throughout the Americas, down among the Inca as well, textiles are key to understanding any kind of social interaction. Textiles are exchanged, they're hoarded, to the extent that this little image that you see over to the left-hand side, which comes from a Maya pot, shows in a distilled form all that is expected by a king of tribute, of something that would flow into a court, and as you suspect, into this tomb itself. There are quetzal feathers, there are bits of jade, and underneath, heaped and bundled and trussed up, are the textiles that we indeed found in this tomb. It seemed to have been a plain weave. There was some evidence of embroidery, and it certainly contained more than one kind of fiber. Regrettably, all you're looking at here is the residue of the bug excrement that was left behind as they consumed these textiles, but we've been able to see what was there. And then old things are important. We pass by antique stores here. We see old things we covet or don't. If you're a modernist, you like that kind of decor, IKEA-style decor. But the Maya liked assembling old things, and it happens that within this tomb, we have bowls that must have been 200 years old at that time. So who was here? As I wrap up this talk, I'm going to now try to bring it back into a larger discussion, not of the summation of roles, but also of who was this king? Why was this effort made for him? The only text we have in the tomb, I regret to say, was this microglyph, a set of microglyphs, which have not done very well, as you can see here. Regrettably, they're completely illegible, but they would have been what we call a name tag. They would have told us who the owner might have been. These were attached to a prophetic or divinatory mirror that was placed close to the king's head. But we do have hieroglyphic texts which have been able to decipher from sites that we know to have been under the sway of El Zotz. For instance, from one of the cities that was probably a pleasure or summer palace of the El Zotz or the Diablo kings, we have the very famous, at least to Mayanists, Bejucal Stela II. And notice the date, 381, AD 381. And there I've highlighted for you the name of the very first king we know from the El Zotz dynasty. He seems to have been some aspect of a mythic turtle. But most important here is down below. He is the underling of the figure depicted on the stela at Tikal. It is said explicitly here in the glyphs that he is the vassal of the Achal, of someone who we know not to have been a local figure, who almost certainly came from a distant location. This is none other than he who was born from fire, Siak-ak. So the package here is getting a little more interesting. We're going beyond simply a statement very vaguely and generally about the role of kings to a particular historical argument about what would motivate the placement of this tomb. Now, we also have a suite of AMS dates. I'm not going to go into all of the dweebery here in relation to these, but take my word for it that they're fully consistent in sequence. We have some old wood with intercept dates of about 340. The altar, where they seem to be hacking up bodies and little babies, about 375. And then the sanctuary placed on top that had sealed the tomb underneath is taking us a few decades on. And we'll be working with these dates a little bit more. The ritual milieu of this time, too, points elsewhere. It does not point to Tikal necessarily, but beyond to that other world that's reverberating from an empire many, many kilometers away. The ritual milieu, for instance, is one that is intrinsically connected to fire and rituals of transformation, which do not seem here to be very local. For instance, the only other place where we have been able to detect these poor little babies compressed and burnt into these little bowls is Teotihuacan, where they were found in great abundance now in deposits of the Pyramid of the Sun. In addition to that, the tomb mortuary furniture is, as you can see here, consists of these little bowls, little porringer over the side, direct analogs to pottery being made at Teotihuacan at that time. Albeit playing, you might say, in the idiom, I suspect they might have well have been a local manufacturer, but they are certainly alluding to a foreign civilization. So as we wrap this up, what is there like this at this time? What else is going on in terms of this life world, so to speak, or you might call it the death world of Maya kings? Well, not too far away at Tikal were found tombs that were quite similar. This is one, regrettably, which only is available to us in this rather bad crumpled photograph from the national newspaper in Guatemala, found in tombs by probably the greatest Guatemalan archaeologist ever, Juan Pedro Laporte, in a place called the Lost World Complex, in Mundo Perdido. And you will see here all those other Disneyfied little beasts here in a variety of bowls. Regrettably, this has never been particularly well published. What has been well published, though, is a tomb found by the University Museum Project from Pennsylvania within the heart and the core of Tikal itself. And this is the very, very famous, at least again to Mayanists, Tikal Burial 10. What do we know about this? We all believe that this is the tomb of the Maya lord put into position by Siak-ak, In other words, the correlations here between an historical record that attests to all of this belligerence between dynasties and far-flung empires, it is one that is brought into a very concrete dimension here by the tomb itself. His name was Yashnun Ahin. It's a Maya word. It's not at all like any word that would be foreign. He seems to possibly have been maybe a combination of local and foreign dynasties brought together, but he's being buried here in a singular way. He's got his little marimba in the background, for instance, of turtle shells, but also note here, he's not going into the tomb alone. He's about 35 years of age, and in addition to that, we have children that are now a little bit older, children that might even have been servitors or pages at court. 12 years, 7, 11, down to 7 years. Many more such used, but now at a slightly different age range from what we had seen in the tomb over at Diablo. And then, most famous of all to Mayanists perhaps, and known to all readers of National Geographic magazine, are the extraordinary set of founders' tombs recovered by the late Robert Scher and his colleagues under a temple dedicated to the sun at Copan. And this is consisting respectively of the Hunal and Margarita tombs, and we know without question that one of them is a figure who's attested and described in the hieroglyphic records of the site as someone who went to Teotihuacan to receive jurisdiction, you might say, to receive a kind of legitimate authorization from the empire, and then he came back and eventually seems to have been buried within this deposit. It is on very, very different kinds of deposits, and thereafter things shift utterly. But above all, it is linked to the sun. The temples, as they're rebuilt and rebuilt by subsequent generations, venerating this founder, continue to play out the same theme of the sun, which is resurgent, of course, comes out again and again. And that is the name of this king, Kinich-Yashkutmal. This is not just among the Maya. This idea of implanting the sun, of implanting dynasties with respect to the sun, is something that we see richly attested in all sorts of evidence across this world, which we can study, I think, in necessary relation to the Maya. Now, this is from one of the most important ritual documents. It's called the Codex Vienna, which is in Vienna. And what it shows is the beginning of the world. And what does it show? A bloody, almost ruined temple. And rising out of it are emblems of the sun. And within one of those emblems is actually I would say a Mexican version of a Maya glyph, of a Maya name, because it reads, one flower, Hunahao, and that's the name of one of the most important founders of a Maya civilization. Many people feel incorrectly that Aztecs were devising these on the basis of local antecedents, and now we know, thanks to the work of Carl Talba, that much of what we understand to be Aztec concepts are Maya ultimately in origin. That's what they link back to. But above all, it is this idea that beginnings have to do with solar emergence at the beginnings of all time and also at the beginnings of dynasties. How do we know about this dynastic aspect? Because here in a different book called the Codex Nuttall, which is found now not too far from here in Cambridge, England, we have explicitly a statement in that document, which is almost exclusively dynastic, referring to the biography of a particular Mixtec ruler in the Valley of Oaxaca, or close to the Valley of Oaxaca, in which an entire new dynasty is placed on this landscape. But what is the metaphor? What is the trope by which they play around with? It is a sun that arises out of the ground on a pedestal of blood. So ultimately, I think this is really what we're dealing with here in the Temple of the Night Sun. It isn't just about that king, because dead kings don't care about themselves, probably, I say as somewhat agnostically. It is those who come afterwards who care about them, who lovingly tend their memories, who build things like the Temple of the Night Sun in order to link that king to something that they in turn wish to tether their own identity towards. The east-west orientation I mentioned before here is absolutely crucial, but also the fact that, as we suspect, the sanctuary in front, which is open and accessible, might have been employed for later accession rituals by the king, something we can discuss a little bit later. But right now I'm going to finish this lecture because we've run out of time, and you've been very patient with me at the end of a busy, busy work day. I understand that Marshall Solins was about to give a talk here, and how could I not mention Stranger Kings, something that some of you probably know about. And this is the idea that new kings are a bit of a problem. That is, the way to establish a new king is not to elevate someone out of the local aristocracy That's going to create all sorts of hubbub and problems and jealousies, and it will lead to endless difficulties. But rather, you bring the king in part from somewhere else. You link his identity for some far distant location, and yet you also wish to underscore that this is an adept, someone that knows how to function locally to a very high standard. And that seems to be some of the themes that are probably played out in this particular tomb. And above all, what does the king want to do? They don't want to emphasize that kings die as they will, they all surely will, but rather that they're part of resurgent cycles that come back again and again and again. And that's where you link up ultimately to the hierophanies of the sky above, which they seem to have done here in the Temple of the Night Sun. And therefore, in this new sun of the building, they're also establishing probably a new creation of a kings and of kingship locally that will go on and on and on. Thank you.